What does my faith mean to me? I mean, it's purpose. For me, it's purpose. It's a reason to be here on earth, the reason I'm here, the reason every other person's here. It allows me to see, I think my faith, the thing I like about the way I've come to my own Christian faith and how it's evolved in some ways over my adult life is it's given me a much healthier view of people who don't believe like me. And I think that's where my upbringing, my denomination that I grew up in, that's where they always aggravated me, even when I was working there. Because if you didn't believe exactly like them, like I moved to New York City, I'm surrounded by all kinds of religions. My wife is Jewish, and she's Jewish. She's not a Messianic Jew. She's a cantor. She's a minister. People are like, well, how can you be with a minister? Because I understand the life of a minister. I'm a minister's husband today. I'm still involved in works of faith, in the synagogue, in a place of worship today. But what my faith does is allows me to see her from it, because of the way it's grown and way I think God's spoken to me, is to be able to see people who don't have this, what we would have grown up thinking of as a personal relationship with Jesus. You know, if you don't have that. So my wife, on our very first date, asked me if I thought she was going to hell because she was Jewish. And I'd never been asked that before. And we were getting along. This was not a job interview. She just wanted to know what my perspective was. And I remember saying, you wouldn't go to hell. Well, again, she wasn't asking what I thought. She was asking where I'm from, my church, because she knew I was a former minister. At the time, I was working for a church. I was working for the Salvation Army at the time, so I was still involved with the church. And she asked me about it, and I said, where I grew up, it's not that you're Jewish, or even if you're Muslim, it's that you don't believe in Jesus the way that I do. You can be a Catholic, and many people in my denomination would think there's no way you're going to heaven. You could be a Baptist, and we have people we grew up with that think that you may not get into heaven, right? Because of the way they viewed sin and atonement and the eternity of it. So my faith, what it means to me, is allows me to deal with people because I know what I believe in, and I know what I can trust, and what I know for sure is factual based on my own discovery of that. And it's okay if somebody doesn't believe that those things I believe are factual. That's fine. It doesn't change it at all. If Jesus is real, he doesn't need me to defend him. Because it's allowed me to I have friendships, and I touch people who, from all kinds of faiths, I think, because of the way that my faith has grown in my 52 years on the earth.
Yeah, for me, faith was, again, going back to our basics and the way we were brought up. It's your belief in God, your belief in Jesus Christ, and accepting him as your Savior. And so then how do we incorporate that into our lives? And again, going back with what Aric said, with as people come into church, just say for a regular Sunday service, people are already looking at who's coming in the door. And if they don't have that same strong faith or belief like we do, you can almost see judgment from others to those people that maybe are trying to learn what their faith is about. And I think a lot of people in the world think that Christians are judgmental, or that God's very judgmental, and he does. He will judge, at least by the way we believe, one day, right? But as things happened in the end, again, I won't get into everything, but when my ministry then was gone because of a divorce, it wasn't that I believed differently about God or about Christ or his church, but what I lost faith in was those, and if you don't mind me doing the quotes, God's people. Because Jesus went into places where people didn't know him, didn't want anything to do with him. but he went to those places and pulled people out. And that's what we should be doing, just as a people, not just as a conservative Christian. So today, what Aric's saying really parallels with me. I do see a lot more people in a different way than just who's coming into church today. And so my ability to interact with others of different faiths, religions, belief systems, races, genders, you name it. I am so much more comfortable in my own skin and not just having to follow those expectations and what's expected out of us as a minister, because I'm just a person of this world like anybody else.
That's what this movie's about. I tried to take every experience that I did, and my ex-wife and Keith and other friends of mine who were in ministry. I tried to take all the things I saw and just try to. You have to change the circumstance, because it's not a lot of the stuff that happened to us or what you go through aren't that exciting from a movie. So you have to make it more sensationalized. You have to have it more powerful and make higher stakes and all those things for a movie like this. But it's what you're just trying to get to that emotion. That emotion: did I make the right choices as a career? Am I good enough? How come my friends have a bigger church than me? How come they're getting asked to preach at the camp meeting and I'm not? All those different emotions of not being enough, really. No matter how many times you preach a message that Jesus, he had fishermen and tax collectors as his disciples, and those guys were told all their lives they weren't good enough to be religious leaders. That's the Jewish culture. That's you become a rabbi that's who matters in their culture, and especially in those times. And even now, to have a rabbinical title means something to a Jewish person and to that community. But no matter how many times you look and say Jesus chose the guys who weren't good enough and made them good enough, it's still there's so those emotions that you experience are really what this film's about. There were certain things I absolutely loved about being a preacher. I loved speaking in front of people. I could do it every time I was done. I wanted to do it again. I was like playing a game of basketball. Game's over. You win, you lose, whatever. Let's run it back. Let's play more. I want to do it again right now. And I love that part of it. There's certain parts of it. I have a joke on stage when people ask me why I don't preach anymore. I say it's because of the last sermon I preached, which was entitled "Let Me Tell You Idiots Something," which was not really my last sermon, but there's a preacher's. It's just the people you have to deal with, the things you have to deal with. The people have their own. They're coming at it from their own perspective, and it sometimes doesn't make sense to you. You attend board meetings, you do all those things that really are a job. But for me, preaching and speaking and running a good event, those were the things I loved about that.
I think before I talk about what life as a minister was, I think it's pretty appropriate to go back and talk about how do we become a minister. Growing up in a very conservative church, there's a lot of expectations of you. Now, when I made a decision at one point as an individual to decide to go into ministry, we believe and we hope it was a calling from God, or we would say from the Holy Spirit spoke to me, this is what I need to do. I think looking back, a lot of that was really expectations that was put on myself. I can't speak for Aric in this, but expectations, what others around me wanted or felt I should be doing, and those influences helped me make a decision. Though I said I've been called, it were those influences that finally directed me to take that step. So then, after college at Ohio Christian, I was appointed to youth pastor work, to several senior pastor to where I was the leader of the church. And all of those occasions were with, again, people of like faith, like upbringings, and those expectations always continue to follow in kind of the same way. So then, as a minister, you have these expectations of how you need to live up to what others want, when the whole work should be about how am I living up to God. And taking small churches and growing them in numbers seemed like the only way you were getting, not satisfaction, but maybe, what's the word I'm looking for? Validation for what you're doing by showing what you could do with a church or could do as a minister. And I'm saying all this to say I believe, as we're talking about this film, God's will, and some ways in which it relates to us, is that those expectations are what finally, in the end, kind of hurt me, did me in, because I'm also a person, not just a minister. I ended up going through a divorce. We won't get into all those reasons, but at a time when I really needed the church and his people, I was basically left out in the cold. And those same people that gave awards and had me up for acceptance speeches and all of a sudden were silent. And so that's one reason why I really got behind this story that Aric wrote and the parallels that it has. And not that, again, as Aric already described, it's not about any particular person and their journey, but we never got to tell our story to people that were supposed to be really like our pastors, our denomination, people that were our superiors, that we really, or I did, again, I can't talk for Aric, but who I really was wanting to confide in, and I couldn't. But those years in ministry were to me personally, satisfying. The end was not. Helping people and being there for others was really the greatest rewards of my life, next to, of course, my children.
He hit on a couple of really important things. I'll start with the last thing, was the divorce thing. And people, why don't you preach anymore? I would. If somebody said, come to my church and preach, and I would be great. I'm not sure how, I would have fun. But that's what happens when you're in that kind of environment. You can get to this point where you aren't part of that club or whatever anymore. And the sad truth is that if your last name's the right thing, or if you got certain deep enough connections to that and you still want to pursue that, then you probably can make that happen. If you don't have the right, I know friends of mine who, they got a divorce or something happened but they still wanted to minister, but because they just didn't have opportunities for them for some reason. So there is this I think that's part of what drives Keith and I to tell this story, is because we really, our ministries fizzled out. They didn't implode. There was no big, I moved away from my church. I started preaching at different churches and being more of a freelance minister, and I would fill in for people whenever they needed a pastor for a few months or whatever. So I did that up until 2010. But when I went through my divorce, I didn't get calls from the people who I worked for. I got friends, a lot of friends. I'm not dogging them at all, because many people reached out to me. I had a lot of friends. I wasn't alone during that period of my life. But like he said, the people who we thought were our pastors really never did come back and hey, how you doing? What's going on? I heard this is going on. It becomes a rumor type mill of people hearing things, and you heard something from somebody else, and it's just something that I didn't want a part of anymore. So I had no desire to go back and get that kind of connection or that apology or just somebody asking me. Some people I worked for these folks, right? These are supposedly my mentors, and they just never did say much to me afterwards. And that's okay. They got their own stuff they're working on. The other thing that he mentioned was living the life of a preacher, but in our world, you didn't just make that as a vocational choice. This was a spiritual wrestling of I'm going to give up and that was the message. Now, in hindsight, as a more mature person, I think that isn't necessarily what's true, but people, when they're in that situation, it's literally laying everything at the altar. My life is yours, whatever you want to do with me. I'm giving up all my worldly pursuits. For me, that meant leaving pre-med with a full ride scholarship. And I had med school lined up to pay through an organization in my county. But I thought that what I was here to do was not to be a scientist, because that's what a doctor was. I was already 2 years into it. And the more I got into it, the more I had to study, the harder it got, no matter how smart I was. I had gotten by on being, having a good memory and all that up until this point. But now this really takes intense 10-hour, 15-hour a day away from society so I can learn these things. So, I was getting into that, and I'm like, this isn't who I am, and I started looking for what should I do, and then that's it, in the summer of 1990, my life changed, because I decided to leave Ohio University and go to Circle of Bible College for the sole reason of being a preacher. Luckily, I could play basketball too, which I did enjoy, but that was the only reason I went. I had no preconceived delusion of grandeur. I was just going to lay my life at the altar and let God do with it what He would. And looking back, there's some people could say, well, you didn't make the right decision. You should have been a doctor, or maybe you should have done something in business or whatever. But at the end of the day, what I'm doing now is the same thing I think I was called to do back then, and that is to inspire people to tell stories, to connect stories that don't really seem like they apply to you, but yet show you, hey, that we're all humans and we share a certain thing. And the expectation, that's the other thing he mentioned. That was applauded. My grandmother could not have been happier when I left being a doctor. It's so weird because my dad wasn't a churchgoer back then, so I didn't grow up in like we call a Christian home. Like it wasn't, my dad was a truck driver, and he drank, and my mom, she smoked, and they were just, they were normal human beings, but they just didn't go to church. But my grandma and my aunt, they always took me to church, and my grandmother was so happy whenever I decided to leave med school and go to. She'd buy me suits. She was so happy I loved her. She's the one angel in my life from the beginning. I just loved my grandmother. Now, of course, my dad was the opposite. My dad would not let me work in high school so I could get good scholarships. He made me go let me play basketball and baseball, but no, you're not getting a job. You can work in the summers, but during the school year, you focus on your grades, because he knew that would pay off in the end more than a minimum wage job during school year. So he had sacrificed that and took care of everything we needed, and now I think it really hurt him when I went and did that. But so two different reactions to that same decision. But it was applauded. People loved it. They had me stand up at camp meeting in front of 2,000 people. That's why even like stand-up comedy, I don't ever get nervous, no matter who I'm in front of. I was standing in front of 2,000 people when I was 19 years old, talking about these very things, and comfortable. I wasn't good, but I was comfortable with it. So with that environment really is what this film is about to me. It's because it's there. You're born into it. Most people don't choose to move to a place, a very white Anglo-Saxon Bible Belt community. Most people don't choose to move there just to be there. So you're born into it, and those influences and that culture, it affects you. And if you don't have a healthy view of it, it can be very detrimental to you mentally and emotionally. So again, this story, we're trying to highlight as much of that as we can. What's going on there now, I don't know. I haven't been at a church in my old denomination. I've gone maybe twice to a church back home in the last 10 years, maybe that. So I don't know what they're teaching now. And some of these guys are still my good friends, and they're doing great things. I pray for them. I hope and just know that God's using them in different ways. But there is such an expectation laid upon you and there's so little wiggle room to mess up. And if you do, there's the things you have to go through to get back into the fold, if you will. And it's not just on a minister level. It's on a small, I mean, on a lay person level. I remember growing up, a lot of my friends drank. I never drank any alcohol until I was like in my 30s before I had my first like drink of alcohol. I never drank in high school or college or any of that. But I had a lot of friends when I was growing up that did. And the thing was, you couldn't do both. You couldn't go to church if you were at the bar on Saturday. And I always thought that was really ignorant. Like, because now that I've gotten older and I'm away from that faith, there's a lot of people that do that. And I've always thought, why wouldn't a person, just because they had beers on Saturday, why couldn't they go to church on Sunday? Well, it's because those two lifestyles are incompatible where I'm from. Tim McGraw has a song, drugs or Jesus, right? There's one or the other. You don't get to do both. And because I always thought, what if that person who you think's sinning on Saturday night because they're drinking, what if they felt comfortable to come into the church on Sunday? Wouldn't that lead them towards the life that, even if that's the life that's right, having that freedom to come to the church would at least move them along that path? So there's just so much expectation that we had laid upon us that, I mean, it's just a lot to bear. And in God's will, we cover that in various ways, because it's a fishbowl, especially if you're a minister, especially if you're good at it in any way. If you're expected to be the next general superintendent, district superintendent, and we knew who those people were going to be back then. We knew this person would be this person would be that, and you're just being watched to a point where it can get overwhelming. And I won't speak for anyone that's not Keith or I, but I know friends, girls that I knew growing up, and just the ways that they were forced to dress. You have to wear a dress. You can't wear pants. You can't wear short sleeves, and it could get whacked out of how they treat these women. And you wonder, why does this woman have body issues, or why does she have modesty issues later on? Because she's been conditioned to think that she's nothing but a sexual object, and then you have to hide that in order for because you can't. And it was always the men saying it. I'm like, you're the pervert then. You know what I mean? It's just elbows, man. It's such a misogynistic approach. And as a man who has 3 daughters, I want my daughters to feel confident and free and passionate about who they are, and not suppressed by someone overlording them in the name of God to say how they should act and behave and how they should even dress. It's just those expectations are just so much in the DNA of that kind of religious thinking that you can't even point it out. It's like having cancer through every lymph node of this body. Like, it's just everywhere. And that's the way that this kind of expectation, this unlivable you can't live up to it. It's in everything that happens there.
Because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Because